All right, so thank you very much for the opportunity to give this talk. Once again, the title of my talk is Gender, Ethnicity, and Violence During the Nigerian Civil War. The Nigerian Civil War was a war that occurred between 1966, 67, and 1970. And this was a war that was fought between a particular ethnic group called the Biafrans. They occupy a place called the southeastern region of Nigeria in modern Nigeria, in today's Nigeria. And some of you might have come across someone who identified themselves as Igbo, for instance. Yeah, so that's the region where they're from. And they were the ones who actually transformed their identity from Igbo to Biafrans in 1967, specifically on May 13, 1967, when Biafra was declared as an independent or a separate state from Nigeria. That was what, unfortunately, led to that very conflict that claimed close to, approximately 3 million lives in that area. So that is what I'm going to be talking about today. So the title again, once again, thank you very much for having me. I'm Taiwo Bello, an assistant professor of African history at Oklahoma State University. So let's get into it because we don't have enough time. So before I get into the main issue, I feel like it is important to give a brief background of how the whole thing occurred or evolved, right? There was a military coup that took place in 1966. This was exactly January the 15th, 1966. And that coup was championed by an individual by the name Kaduna Nzego. Kaduna Nzego was an Igbo person. He belonged to the Igbo ethnicity. But that very coup claimed the lives of Nigeria's prime minister and some key individuals from the northern part of the country. So as a result of that, the guys within the Nigerian army who came from the northern part of Nigeria felt that that was a conspiracy against them. Having killed Nigeria's prime minister, who came from that very region, and also having killed Sadana of Sokoto by the name Taiwo Bello. He was also assassinated in that very coup that was staged by an individual who came from the eastern part of Nigeria, who belongs to the Igbo ethnic group. So these guys decided to stage their own coup, which was later tagged as a counter coup. And that very counter coup occurred on July the 29th, 1966, which was a few months after the very first coup of January 15th, 1966 was staged. In that coup, the person who took over and declared himself as the military head of state after Tafawa Balewa, who was the premier of Nigeria, took over power, was assassinated. The name of that person is Aguiyi Ironsi. Aguiyi Ironsi was an Igbo man. It's like an Igbo person staged a coup that claimed the lives of key political figures from the northern part of the country. And then, instead of an Hausa person or someone from the north to take over position, it was someone from the region where the coup planners came from that took over power. This is where the idea about, this is an Igbo conspiracy against us from the northern part of the country. So the person who took over power from Tafawa Balewa, who was from the northern Nigeria, and declared himself as the military head of state, was Aguiyi Ironsi. So Aguiyi Ironsi took over power. But when he took or after he took over power, the Northerners were expecting him to prosecute those who staged the false coup. He promised at first that he would deal with them, that the law would catch up with them. But unfortunately or eventually, he had a turnaround and said, oh, they've been forgiven. We are not going to do anything to them. So that upsets the military guys from the northern part of the country, and then they decided to stage the counter coup. In that very counter coup, Aguiyi Ironsi was assassinated. That was an Igbo person. But the protesters or the people who were trying to avenge the killings or the assassination of their leaders from the northern part of the country did not stop at that. Instead, they continued to attack anybody living in the northern part of the country, which was their own region, but had or claimed Igbo identity. So if you were from the northern part of if you lived in the northern part of the country, but you were from this southeastern part of the country or the southern part of the country, especially eastern Nigeria, today's eastern Nigeria, such person would be attacked. So the Northerners did not stop at the point where they assassinated Aguiyi Ironsi, but rather they continued that violence against individuals that could not defend themselves, who were Igbos. So a lot of Igbos were killed. Approximately 30,000 Igbo people were killed in the northern part of the country. So as a result of the continuous attack, or what I call inter-ethnic violence, this man right here, his name is Odumegu Ojukwu. He was a key figure. In short, he was the governor of the eastern part of the country, and the area that succeeded, that declared secession from Nigeria in 1967. So as the governor, he felt it was his responsibility to protect his people. So what he did then was to ask everybody, all Igbo people from different parts of the country, to return to eastern or southeastern Nigeria. So they all returned. They migrated in millions from Lagos, from key cities. They returned to the region. But because the government was not prepared for the responsibilities of taking care of those who were returning, they would have to provide accommodation for them. They would have to provide food for them. They would have to, provide money for them to survive on a daily basis. The government felt the huge responsibility on its neck. So as a result, they felt, look, now the government of Nigeria is not doing anything, and we are no longer safe. We will declare ourselves independent of Nigeria. Since the country is not doing anything for us, they are killing us, we are dying on a daily basis. And the person who had taken over from Aguiyi Ironsi after he got killed by the name Yakubu Gowon, that's Yakubu Gowon right there, could not do anything to stop the violence against the Igbo. So in order for them to escape the violence that was being launched against them, they declared their own republic. And remember that this was not a new republic, but it was a republic declared from the Federation of Nigeria. But unfortunately, this area that was declared the Republic of Biafra on May 30th, 1967, was the area that had the oil resources that Nigeria was getting a lot of money from. Right. So when you declare a place that was funding a nation separate or independent of Nigeria, it means that Nigeria would go broke. And if that happened, Nigeria would no longer be what it was, the strongest nation on the continent of Africa. And in order to stop there, therefore, this individual, Yakubu Gowon, who was the military head of state as of that time, decided to impose to impose blockade on Biafra. So this is the place. This is the northern part of Nigeria where the violence was taking place. In all these areas, Sokoto, Kaduna, Katsina, Nguru, Zaria, and the likes. And when Biafra was declared, this place used to be southeastern Nigeria, southeastern region. But when it was declared, it became known as Biafra, as a Republic of Biafra. But the government of Nigeria did not want these people to go because, for the reason that I mentioned. That's the region that had the oil resources in the country. So in order to stop them, Yakubu Gowon and his officers decided to impose blockade on Biafra. And what that blockade did was to prevent food and other types of resources that the people would need to survive from entering their republic, now that they have declared themselves independent. So it didn't take long before the impact of that blockade began to emerge on the people. The war itself started on July the 8th, 1967. But by January of 1968, starvation had begun to catch up with the people in Biafra. The war was going on, but people didn't have access to food. They didn't have access to water. They didn't have access to all the things that would have made life livable for them. And that's what we see in this picture. This very picture to my left here shows children, holding bowls, asking for food to survive because there was no food. So the little food that was smuggled into the country by the international humanitarian organizations like the ICRC, Joint Church Aid, and others, was what the people had access to, and it was not enough. Right? So we can see this, and here we can see this child being, strapped on the back of his mother. We don't know what has happened to this child. Maybe this child is dead, maybe this child is starving, maybe this child is just sleeping, we don't know. But what we know for sure is that this child is in a very precarious situation. And this very child, we can see the impact of starvation on him. If we look around his neck like this, we can see that this is a child that lacks the essential nutrients that we have made him to live properly. The same thing, if we look at that very picture, that's also the impact of blockade. Women and children looking for food to feed, right? They look like beggars there. But one thing that people resorted to, because the starvation was already catching up with them, one thing the global international organization urged them to do was, in exchange for protein, because they didn't have access to protein, the blockade prevented all the essential nutrients, nutritious foods, from coming into Biafra. So in order for them to gain access to protein, international organizations like the ICRC, the Joint Church Aid, amongst others, officials advised or urged them to be consuming lizard. And lizard in the pre-war years was something that people would certainly kill on sight. Nobody would hit lizard before the war. But because the international organizations had advised them to consume lizard in order for them to live to see the following day, right? They began to consume lizard. In short, lizard became extremely essential for survival. So if you didn't have money, you would not be able to afford lizard in Biafra as of that. Today, when they see this, they feel bad that some of their parents or their people had to consume lizard in order to survive during the war. And that's part of the things that continue to keep the memory of the war alive till date. Because as we speak, those people are still fighting for their independence. It didn't die away with the declaration of the end of the war in 1970. As we speak now, they are still fighting. Some of them are still being arrested, killed, attacked by Nigerian security officials. So it's an ongoing struggle like that. So we see some of the impact, and this is a picture of myself and one of the people that I interviewed during my field work in 2019. I interviewed this man in a village in Owerri. Owerri is a city in one of the southeastern states. And Owerri was one of the key places where the war occurred, where people fought heavily during that war. And this man right here was one of the children affected or impacted by the starvation in Biafra. So he told me that, I mean, if you look carefully at this picture, that's me, I look like a giant. I'm not very tall. I'm not very huge, right? But standing beside him, I look like a giant. He said that very starvation actually impacted his growth. So till date, he's still struggling with that very memory. He said it was as a result of that some of his siblings who were not impacted or affected by starvation in Biafra as of the time, they grew way taller than himself. But, I mean, here, this also still takes us to why the memory of the war continues to rage in that very region. Because when you wake up, you look at yourself and you're like, why am I this short? Right? It makes you want to fight. It is one of those actually supporting the neo-Biafran movements today as a result of that memory. So what happened? We had the international humanitarian and church organizations, like I mentioned, the Joint Church Aid, the International Committee of the Red Cross. They did their best. They did what they could. The United States government also gave food. The United States government gave food, other kinds of supplies that people needed. But these supplies were only reaching the center cities in Biafra. The people who lived in the remote areas, like villages, could not gain access. So what the women from that area, from all those remote villages did, was to look for a way to survive. Because food was not coming in, and their children were dying, their husbands were dying, their family members were dying, including the soldiers who were there, either their husbands, either their uncles, either their brothers, either their sons. And at the least enlisted in the Biafran army, they were dying because they didn't have access to food. So what these women decided to do was to embark on a very dangerous smuggling enterprise called Afia attack. Afia in the Igbo language is markets. Attack signifies the violence that characterized that very trading engagement. So what these women did was to travel around past 12 midnight. They would travel several miles, several kilometers, walking and trying to avoid Nigerian soldiers from seeing them because war was ongoing. They couldn't travel to get food during the broad daylight because that was when war was fought. That was when fire was exchanged between Nigerian soldiers and Biafran soldiers. So what these women would do was they would travel all the way, they would look for a way, they would gather themselves, like sometimes in 20s, in 30s, in 40s, and they would gather themselves together and they would travel. They would be working in one fire. And they would travel to markets in places around Biafra where war was not happening. So they would go to those places and buy food and bring those foods back into Biafra to feed themselves, to feed their children, and feed Biafran soldiers. Remember I mentioned that those soldiers were also the family members of those women. So they would go, but unfortunately, while these women were traveling, this was one of the women who participated in that dangerous trade after the attack. But either while they were traveling or while they were coming, Nigerian soldiers often confused them for the Biafran soldiers, the enemies, coming to attack them. So the moment Nigerian soldiers heard noise or sound coming from wherever, they would open fire. And as a result, they killed a lot of women. This woman was one of those who saw corpses of fellow traders, fellow women looking for food to survive, to escape the impact of the starvation that was ongoing in their region. So these women engaged in this trade. And as we see here, this is a picture of these women, of Biafran women, after they had collected food, after they had traveled several miles, they had brought food into Biafra, they would supply the food to Biafran soldiers to consume. And food was central in this war. Why? The Nigerian government in the first place decided to impose that blockade on Biafra to prevent food from getting to Biafran soldiers, so that those soldiers would surrender as quickly as possible. The Nigerian government had planned to win the war against these people within 2 months. But because the soldiers had access to food, they had enough strength to continue to fight. And what that meant was that it upset the strategies of the war strategies of the Nigerian government. So as a result of that, you can see these women would supply food to these soldiers. And if we look at this very picture very well, also, that's women feeding soldiers. The soldiers were the enemies of the Nigerian soldiers. But these women were playing critical role, important role, in the sense that they were feeding the soldiers, helping them to survive, to continue to live, to fight against Nigerian soldiers. And in some cases, these soldiers were not just fighting, they were also killing Nigerian soldiers. They were winning in some cases. So this upset the Nigerian government. This should not be the case. We have to do something. And if you look at this picture very well, the man standing right here, I don't have a stick to show, but this very man right here is in soldier uniform, is in army uniform. He must have gone there to collect his fair share of the food that these women had smuggled into Biafra. So a lot of soldiers visited these women to collect food from them in areas that were very secretive, not very known to Nigerian soldiers or Nigerian government. So they would go, the soldiers would go there, they would collect their share, they would consume the food, and then they would return to the war theater to fight. So that upset the Nigerian government, and the Nigerian government then therefore decided to, rather than paying so much attention to the soldiers, let's pay attention to those that were feeding them fat. Because if we block their sources of food, they would surrender as quickly as possible. Then that compelled the Nigerian government to turn attention to the women instead. So the women, as we see in warfare, we see them as victims, as people who should not be attacked and the likes. In the view of the Nigerian government, that was no longer the case. They began to be considered or to be seen as combatants, because they were the ones supplying these soldiers. So it became a crime. That's me in the middle of these individuals. These people experienced the war. In short, this man worked for the Biafran government, and this woman also participated in the healthcare attack trade that I described earlier. So they saw the war, and they told me that the Nigerian soldiers abducted women, they raped their women, they sexually molested the women, and also majority of those women were forced into forced marriages. As a way to punish them. We have to punish them. But it didn't stop at that. They also collected the food that some of these women were bringing into Biafra. They seized the food, and majority of them did not have access to it. This is also one of the women that participated in that trade. In addition to that, their homes were bombed. And if we look at this very picture, bomb had been thrown down this very road And this is the woman, this woman crying here. We don't know, maybe she had lost her husband in that very attack. Maybe she had lost her home. But she must be going through a certain level of pain here or agony as a result of that war in this case. And this was for no reason other than the attack that the Nigerian government launched on areas where women actually existed. So add to that, because the majority of these women lost their homes, they were displaced in their homeland. They became refugees. And if we look at this picture very carefully, these women, they are carrying loads. They didn't know where they were going. They were walking aimlessly. So many of them actually got lost in the process of looking for a place to hibernate for safety. So add to that, this is part of the military response, because the women would gather in marketplaces to distribute the foods that they were bringing into Biafra. The Nigerian government never stopped bombing markets controlled by these women. And we can see here the impact. If you look at the neck of this lady, bomb had hit her right here. This is a woman. This is one woman. This is another woman. And here is another woman right here. And here is another one. This happened at the market in a place called Anambra. So the market bombing, through the market bombing, a lot of women were killed because the Nigerian government decided to turn against them. So if we look at all that I've said, right, in war we often look at women as victims. But indeed, in the case of the Nigerian Civil War, the women, of course, they were victims of the violence of the Nigerian government. But at the same time, they were active participants in the conflict, in the sense that they helped keep the Biafran rebellion ongoing for more than 2 years. Without the support that the women gave to Biafra, Biafra would have been defeated within the first few months. Thank you very much.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
So, do Biafran women today have a different conception of what it means to be a woman than maybe women in other parts of Nigeria because of this experience?
Yes. Like I said, they are still fighting now. It's still ongoing. Mm-hmm. The violence is still ongoing. The conflict is still ongoing. And amongst the people that are leading the neo-Biafran movements are women. I just submitted an article that I wrote on the neo-Biafran struggle now, focusing on women's roles in that. So these women keep going. They are the ones, launching protests, against the government of Nigeria, against their state government, mobilizing people to support the neo-Biafran groups by the name HIPOB and MASOB, right? HIPOB is the indigenous people of Biafra. MASOB is the movement for the actualization of sovereign states of Biafra. So the women are still playing very key role. But one thing that the roles of the women changed for them during and after the war is that they were able to gain access to more power. It put more power in their hands. Prior to the war, Igbo women were not considered important. They were considered as the old order. Their leaders, their husbands would do anything. Their husbands had absolute control. But during the war, the women gained that power because they fed the nation, because they helped Biafra to live. So from then onward, the respect that the women never had, they were able to get. And that has continued until today. Even though there are still certain limitations, right? They still cannot do certain things, right? Based on customary rule. But they've got certain influences now, much more than they had before in the pre-war years.
I have a follow-up. So
Yes.
is oil still a part of the tension between Biafra and the rest of Nigeria?
Yes, oil is still a big deal. Oil is still a big deal. Oil is still one of the things that are causing divisions amongst not only between the people of that region and Nigeria, but also amongst the different groups themselves. Right. So now you have one group wanting to lay claim to the money that the government was remitting or is remitting into the region. Right. You have different groups now. Like I mentioned earlier, we have IPOB, that's the indigenous people of Biafra, and we still have Mason, right? All of them are fighting to benefit from the cake of oil, or from oil, or derivable from oil. Right. So the oil resources is still a big deal now. And that's also because the Nigerian government has not found another way to diversify. A way to look towards other areas, making money like agriculture or like that. These areas have been abandoned for so long. The moment oil was discovered in Nigeria in 1956, the Nigerian government and Nigerian people left agriculture. That had become the mainstay of the Nigerian economy. That had become the pillar of the Nigerian economy. They left everything and they switched to oil. And as we know, within the oil market, prices fluctuate, right? The price will go up now, and then there's oil clock, right? There's some problem within the global market, and then the prices go down. Which, when the prices go down, it means that the government will not be able to provide infrastructure. It means the government will not be able to provide jobs. It means the government will not be able to have money to do all sorts of things. And if the government is not able to do those, it means some people will lose their jobs. So that's why people keep struggling, people keep fighting. So oil is still one of the issues of contention in today's Nigeria. Yes, please.
Did the Cold War play into this at all?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, that's a brilliant question. Thank you. The Cold War aspect, we hadn't talked about the Cold War with respect to, this very conflict. But I would love to say now that the war itself would not have been fought, but for the Cold War. Why? The people who supplied arms and ammunition to the Nigerian government, the Soviet Union, Britain, Czechoslovakia, and other key countries. And Britain was unstoppable from supplying arms that the Nigerian government was using in enforcing the blockade that was causing the starvation that was killing a lot of people in Biafra because of the Cold War politics. America could not do anything. America had to maintain very close relation. The relationship between the United States and Britain became stronger during the Cold War era. And the politics of the Nigerian Civil War was one of the strings that held both countries together. So the US came together, US and Britain, France supported the Biafrans. US and Britain decided to come together in order to send the Soviet Union out of Nigeria. The Soviet Union did not want to leave. Britain did not want to. And America was a very close ally to Great Britain. So America could not influence Great Britain to stop the supply of arms. Because America knew if I try to do anything to this guy, I'm going to lose my closest ally. And the US did not want that to happen. So the US became like a toothless bulldog in that case. So all the US would do was to give money to help the supply of humanitarian aid. Right. So the Cold War actually played a very huge role. Britain supplied the ground weapons, while the Soviet Union supplied the air weapons, like all the bombs and the likes. Yeah. So without the Cold War, the ongoing Cold War, the war itself would not have happened. Yes, please.
So correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you can't be
Nigeria
wrong.
gained independence in 1960, right?
Nigeria, right?
From Britain.
No, yeah,
It
1960,
was a
October
British
1st.
colony, right?
October 1st, yeah,
Okay.
1960, yes.
1960.
Yes.
Would you say that one of the reasons for the Civil War was the power vacuum left by the British?
Yes, of course. That was also one of the reasons, right? But the British were not interested in going back. They were not interested in going back. The British had said in the beginning that they were not going to support a conflict that happened between brothers. They were called brothers. Right. Not until the British decided to change their stand after the Soviet Union began to supply weapons or deliver weapons to Nigeria. And what was the interest of the Soviet Union? The interest was to take over the control, the influence that Britain had in Nigeria. And secondly, they were interested in moving all the way from Nigeria, because Nigeria was like the most important country on the continent of Africa, the most powerful country on the continent of Africa. So the Soviet Union felt, look, if we get hold of Nigeria, we will be able to spread our influence within other West African countries, and maybe from there to Central Africa, to North Africa, amongst other key places. Right. So the Soviets did that for two reasons. One, to counter, like you said, the British in Nigeria. Let's take over their most prized country in Africa from them. That would upset them. Let's take over them. And secondly, if we take over this by supplying a lot of arms there, by supporting Nigeria and the likes, then we would be able to reach out to spread our influence into other African countries, like Ghana, for instance. I mean, these West African countries like Ghana, Niger, Benin Republic, and others. Also Central, you had Cameroon and Equatorial Guinea and the like. So the Soviet Union were interested in spreading their influence. So they did that. They supported Nigeria for two reasons. They were not interested in the oil, unlike the French that supported that supported the Biafra. The French were interested in the oil resources because they felt if we support these Biafrans and they win independence, we will be in control of their oil. So the French did that for resource reasons. Right. The British also, some people have argued that yes, the British, but I keep arguing that look, resources is not a big deal, because if the British wanted to hold on to the resources, they would not have granted independence to Nigeria in 1960.
But there was a movement of decolonialism.
Of course, this movement had been happening since the head of the First World War. Right. Remember that one of the reasons why Africans enlisted in the military of the Allied power, and also the Axis in the First or the Second World, to support. You remember that the Germans were in Africa, so in Namibia, amongst other places, right? They were also in Tanganyika, right, in today's Tanzania. So these guys were there, right? Africans decided to join those the two fighting parties because they promised them that they would grant them independence. But after the First World War, there was no independence. The two parties renounced. Let's say, okay, Germany was conquered, right? Germany could not do anything. Most of the areas under the control of the Germans were taken control of by the British, and part of which was handed to South Africa by Britain. One of which was Namibia, right? That eventually gained independence later in 1990. Right. So these guys, after the First World War, they promised them, they didn't give them access to that. After the Second World War, for the same reason, they participated in the Second World War. After the Second World War, they didn't give it to them. So these movements have been continuing. The decolonization movement had been since after the First World War. It didn't just begin in the 50s or the 60s. It only reached its height in the 50s. This was after a country like India gained independence. And the majority of African countries were wondering, what's happening? You know, the Indians were also under the control of the British. If the British could give independence to these people, then we also decided to be free. That's when they began to heighten the movement. Right. But the British worked for many, many years prospecting for oil in Nigeria. And they discovered oil. They didn't get a lot of money from that oil that was discovered in 1956. They had spent a lot of money, like billions of pounds, prospecting for over 10 years before 1956. Right. So if they did not want to give independence to these countries, they would not have done that. So oil resources were not, it was more for strategic reasons. In short, if the Soviets had not begun to supply arms, to deliver arms to Nigeria, the British would still have held on to their belief that, or their conviction that they should not, venture into that very conflict. Right.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.